Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese have released the latest budget. The budget they never really wanted to give. And now we can see why. Australia is set to go into deficit for many years to come. Australia's debt level is going to go higher and higher, and Australia is going to become less wealthy over time, as bracket creep causes income taxes to raise ever higher. And in essence, we are spending more money than we are earning, and the government has no path to get growth under control and to get growth powering along. So let's dig into this budget, and you can let me know your thoughts about it in the comments below. Now let's start off by noting that this budget is one that Jim Chalmers never actually intended to or wanted to give. After all, he only is giving it because the election has been delayed, and that was due to ex-tropical cyclone in Queensland. However, now he has to give the budget, and we can see why he didn't want to give it. Because there is a rather large deficit emerging. Now this deficit is clearly not great news. Now of course, to be clear, a large surplus is also not brilliant news that tells us that the government is taking in too much tax revenue. But a large deficit tells us the government is spending far too much money. This is especially since taxes have reached a record high, and since the government has benefited from a commodities price boom and from tax bracket creep. In essence, the government is bringing in more and more revenue, but still has managed to go into deficit. It tells us they're doing a catastrophically bad job. If you're making more money and still spending beyond your means, it tells you your spending is out of control. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be something that is quite filtered into Jim Chalmers at the moment. Nevertheless, we've got that large deficit emerging. The deficit is actually much larger than the government wants to let on. The reason for this is this so-called off-budget spending. Now, that off-budget spending is things that the government has tried to call things like capital expenditures or investments, but in reality, they're not. They're basically just pork barreling. And therefore, everyone needs to look beyond what the government stated deficit is and see the true deficit. Now, the government stated deficit is $179.5 billion over the forward estimates. The actual deficit is even worse, at $283.4 billion over the forward estimates. $250 billion worth of deficits over the forward estimates. That is not a good outcome. Furthermore, last year's budget surplus of $15.8 billion has now turned into a deficit of $27.6 billion, and there's going to be a $42 billion deficit next year. The deficits are getting worse. Spending is also ramping way up, with spending coming in at 27% of GDP. 10 years from now, it is still projected to be about 27% of GDP. By contrast, it was 24.4% of GDP in 2022 to 2023. So that tells us the spending has gone up another 2.5 percentage points of GDP in the span of just this course of Parliament. That's a massive increase in spending. Basically, Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese can't get their spending under control. Now, this is despite the fact that tax is at record highs, and that record high tax is on the back of bracket creep, whereby as inflation is drawing people's income higher, they're going into higher and higher tax brackets, meaning the government actually benefits from inflation, and all of us lose. Furthermore, when you've got relatively high commodity prices, which is what we've got, well, Australia also benefits, but commodity prices are super volatile, so it would be incredibly unwise to spend that windfall from commodity prices. But alas, the Australian government seems to be doing so. Now, in terms of that spending, well, the lion's share of that appears to be going on things like social security and welfare, and also a large amount on health, and then there's the nebulous other purposes that is soaking up a ton of money. However, focusing on the health and social security aspect of it, well, we can see here how the NDIS is playing out. The problem with the NDIS, of course, is not that it's necessarily a bad idea, is that it is growing at 3 times the rate of growth of GDP. 3 times. That's insane. You can't grow something at 3 times the rate of GDP growth forever, because you're just going to run out of money. This is a massive problem, but one that the government doesn't seem to actually really care about. Now, that spending appears to be heading upwards, continually heading upwards. Now, over the past year, spending grew 6% more than inflation. That is insane. It tells us that it is growing much faster than we can afford it to grow. Again, Jim Chalmers doesn't seem to believe there's a problem with this. He seems to believe the government should be at the centre of everything. He seems to believe that spending should go ever higher, and hence why we've got ourselves into this budgetary mess. Now, of course, a deficit translates into more debt, and when you've got more debt, you have to pay interest on that debt. So clearly, as we're getting more and more deficits, we're going to get more and more debt and therefore have to pay more and more interest, which is going to exacerbate the deficit. Now, the government has liked to talk about its tax cut. In its rhetoric talking about the tax cuts, it often is lumping in the Stage 3 tax cuts, which I will note were legislated under the coalition and also were reduced in size by the current federal government. So they're a little bit duplicitous when they go around and talk about the total tax cut. Of course, that isn't really what we need to focus on here. We need to focus on what the Labour government has actually done, which is another incrementally small tax cut. Basically, that will account for about $5 per week in a year's time. The tax cut is relatively minor, and that amounts to $10.3 by July 2027. So that tax cut specifically involves the lowest income tax rate, taking that down from 16% to 15% and then to 14%. Now that is very nice, but it hardly moves the needle. It's $10 a week by July 2027, and then it flatlines. There's no more tax cut, it just flatlines. It is not the same as addressing bracket creep, and it is not the same as addressing inflation. Richard Holden in the Australian Financial Review describes it as follows, and I quote, "The government is stealing a $10 note from you and throwing back a $2 coin, then doing that 2,500 times over. Basically, the government is taking more from you than it is giving back, while still trying to claim that it's giving you a benefit." Another way of thinking about this is it's as if the government has broken your leg, then sold you a crutch, and now expects you to be thankful. But it doesn't work like that, and everyone is seeing through it. In fact, the only person who seems to like this budget is Stephen Koukoulas, who is very much on the Labour train at the moment, and very, very, very much pro-Labour, so I wouldn't exactly call him an impartial source. In any case, he went through some of the economic background here, and he called the economy, quote, spectacular. And I thought this was a rather apt reply, where one person said, "I swear to God, Chalmers could kick the kook square in the nuts, and he would still call it spectacular." Basically getting at the idea that many of the cheerleaders still seem to be on board, but no one who is actually analysing it really is. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with much more spending, a very tiny tax cut, and no attempt whatsoever to deal with the structural deficit that is emerging, and no attempt whatsoever to deal with generating more growth. Because if you're going to have spending, and if you're going to increase spending, you need to grow the economy. Because if you grow the economy, then you grow your tax base, and you can afford that spending. If you don't have economic growth, well, you can't keep increasing your spending because you simply can't afford it. It's something that Stephen Hamilton in the Australian Financial Review has also talked about, where he's argued the government needs to focus on prosperity. Now, Stephen Hamilton also is in favour of dramatic tax cuts, and he would argue that that would increase economic growth. Now, that's something I'll address at another time, but in essence, in this budget, there is nothing to improve productivity, nothing to make people want to work harder, to make people want to work more hours, to make people want to take more risk. For example, say one is working more hours and then is in the top marginal tax rate, then for every hour they work, they're only keeping half hour of their effort. And then people will be thinking, well, do I really want to go out and work another hour, or would I rather spend that time with my kids? Another rubric to think through this is what's called the Laffer curve, which basically argues that there's a point where the tax rate gets so high that not only does growth start to deteriorate, but also your total tax revenue falls as people work fewer and fewer hours and people take less and less risk and economic growth declines. In essence, the government needs to set up the tax settings so that people are incentivized to go out and take risk, and that does involve significant reductions in capital gains tax, and also in things like the small business tax rate. Furthermore, it needs to incentivize people to go out and work harder or work more hours, and one way to do that is by addressing bracket creep, so that people aren't all by default over time going into ever higher tax rates. And people are going to be disincentivized to work more hours when they are in these higher tax rates, which they are falling into quicker and quicker as inflation is really taking hold. But that doesn't seem to be something that Jim Chalmers wants to address. Now, to be clear, Peter Dutton has been rather underwhelming in this regard as well. Peter Dutton does need to focus on how tax cuts can generate economic growth, as I've already talked about. But Peter Dutton doesn't seem to be thinking that way. Peter Dutton seems to think about this at the one point in time where you've got a tax cut, then you need to get a spending cut immediately to deal with that. Rather, to my mind, when you've got a tax cut, you need to consider how will that influence economic growth and also influence behavior, thereby leading to potentially more tax revenue via that growth channel. For example, if you cut capital gains tax, people will transact things like real estate or stocks much more frequently, leading to more revenue, in addition to the economic growth that would latently emerge, in addition to the GST revenue that would emerge when people spend that money. Furthermore, if you address bracket creep, people might want to go out and work more hours. But the government, and also Peter Dutton, to be clear, don't seem to grasp that second-order effect, much to the detriment of everyone else. Now, one thing that is interesting is the government has supposedly forecast a reduction in the amount of immigration in this budget. Whether or not that actually manifests isn't totally clear. I seriously doubt they are going to halve immigration over the next couple of years. So there we go. The budget is a bit of a train wreck to my mind. Deficit as far as the eye can see. Clearly the debt is going to get worse. It does nothing to address productivity. We've got a structural deficit. The government is raking in more and more money, but spending it faster than it's bringing it in. But let me know your thoughts about the budget in the comments below. Do you think it was good? Do you think I'm off base? What do you think about it? I'd be interested to hear what you think. And otherwise, thanks for tuning in, and hopefully I see you next time as well.